The billionaire pretended to be poor to find true love, then betrayed the woman who passed his test. Daniel Reed had spent 7 years pretending to be a man with nothing. On the night his marriage ended, he sat across from his wife at a scratched kitchen table that had cost $40 at a yard sale and told her he could no longer live the life they had built together. Grace stared at him for a long time. There was no shouting, no broken dishes, no dramatic accusation, only silence. Daniel had expected anger because anger would have been easier. He had prepared himself for tears, questions, perhaps even begging. Instead, Grace lowered her eyes to the divorce papers lying between them and slowly touched the silver wedding band on her finger. "Is there someone else?" she asked. Daniel looked away. That was answer enough. Outside their small rented house, rain tapped softly against the windows. The refrigerator hummed. A clock above the stove ticked with almost cruel steadiness. Daniel had faced angry shareholders, ruthless lawyers, and men who controlled companies worth more than small countries. But nothing had ever frightened him as much as the calmness in his wife's face. "Who is she?" Grace asked. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Vanessa." Grace closed her eyes. She knew the name. Vanessa Hale had been part of Daniel's life before Grace ever met him. Or at least, that was the story Daniel had once told. A woman from a world he had supposedly left behind. Someone sophisticated, wealthy, elegant, and connected. Grace had never imagined Vanessa could return. She certainly had never imagined Daniel would choose her. Daniel pushed the divorce papers a little closer. "I'll leave you the car," he said, "and I'll cover the rent for 3 months." Grace looked at the papers. The car was 12 years old. The rent was $800. Daniel Reed, whose private accounts held more money than Grace could have earned in 100 lifetimes, sat across from his wife and pretended that those were the only things he had to offer. Grace did not know he was rich. Not yet. And Daniel told himself that keeping the truth from her made the divorce simpler. It was the same lie he had been telling himself for months. Grace picked up the pen, her hand trembled once, then she signed. Daniel watched the woman who had loved him, when he appeared to have nothing surrender their marriage, without knowing that the man sitting across from her was worth more than $600 million. 3 months later, at a charity gala in Manhattan, Grace would walk into a ballroom filled with cameras and billionaires. She would see Daniel standing beneath the gold letters of the Reed Global Foundation. And for the first time, she would understand that her husband had never been poor. But by then, Daniel would discover something far worse. Grace had passed the test he once created to find true love. And he had failed the woman who passed it. 7 years earlier, Daniel Reed had been 29, angry, wealthy, and exhausted by people who always seemed to know his last name before they knew him. He had grown up in a Manhattan penthouse with private elevators, drivers, security guards, and summer homes in places most people only saw on travel shows. His father, Richard Reed, had built Reed Logistics into one of the largest private transportation companies in North America. His mother, Margaret, had perfected the social side of wealth. She knew which charities mattered, which families were rising, which families were falling, and which marriages would benefit the company. Daniel had been raised to inherit all of it. He hated almost everything about that expectation. At 27, he dated Vanessa Hale, the daughter of an investment banker whose family had been close to the Reeds for decades. Vanessa was beautiful, intelligent, ambitious, and perfectly comfortable in rooms where everyone quietly calculated what everyone else was worth. Margaret adored her, Richard approved of her, Daniel tried to love her. The relationship ended at a dinner in Paris. Daniel had lost his wallet earlier that evening and returned to the restaurant table after calling the hotel. Vanessa was speaking with a friend and did not realize Daniel was behind her. "If he weren't a Reed," she said, "I wouldn't have survived 3 dates." Her friend laughed. Vanessa lifted her champagne. "At least the marriage will be worth it." Daniel stood in the hallway and felt something inside him go cold. He ended the relationship the following morning. Vanessa cried, Margaret was furious. Richard said Daniel was being immature. For the first time in his life, Daniel wondered whether anyone around him would still choose him if his name meant nothing. The thought became an obsession. Within 6 months, he walked away. Not permanently at first. He told his father he wanted a year outside the company. He transferred most of his assets into accounts managed by trustees. He rented a small house in a town called Bellhaven, Pennsylvania, and took a job at an auto repair shop owned by a former Reed logistics mechanic who agreed to keep Daniel's identity secret. He drove an old pickup. He wore work boots. He introduced himself simply as Daniel. No family name that meant anything. No driver, no luxury watch, no invitations, no visible wealth. He expected the experience to become boring after a month. Instead, he met Grace Miller. She came into the repair shop on a Tuesday afternoon because her old Honda was making a sound that she described as a washing machine full of spoons. Daniel laughed before he could stop himself. Grace frowned. Is that a technical diagnosis? No, Daniel said, but it's unusually accurate. She was 30, with brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail, and the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it. She worked at the Bellhaven Public Library and taught reading classes twice a week at a community center. Her car needed a new alternator. Grace did not have enough money. Daniel watched her open her wallet and count what little cash she had. How much can you pay? He asked. Grace looked embarrassed. I can pay all of it, just not today. His instinct was to tell her not to worry about it. Instead, remembering the life he was trying to live, Daniel said, half now, half next month. Grace studied him suspiciously. Why? Because you need the car. That's not usually how businesses work. It is today. She smiled. That smile changed the direction of Daniel's life. Grace returned the next month with the rest of the money. She also brought him a paper bag containing 2 blueberry muffins. For the interest, she said. Daniel had eaten pastries made by chefs with Michelin stars. He remembered those muffins more clearly. They began slowly. Coffee at a diner, a walk through the town festival, a Saturday at a used bookstore. Grace never asked what kind of car Daniel wished he owned. She never asked how much he made. She never asked whether the repair shop had opportunities for advancement. She asked whether he was happy. No one had asked Daniel Reed that in years. He lied about his family. Not completely. He said his father ran a business in New York. He said they had argued. He said he wanted to build a life on his own. All of that was true. He simply left out the part where the business had 12,000 employees. Grace did not push. When Daniel told her he had almost no relationship with his parents, she said, "Then I hope someday it becomes something you can live with, whatever that looks like. Not fix, not forgive, not reconcile, live with." Daniel fell in love with her because she never seemed to demand that he become someone else. A year later, he proposed beside the river. The ring cost $480. Daniel had once bought Vanessa earrings worth $30,000. The cheap ring made him more nervous. Grace stared at it, then at him. Are you sure? Daniel laughed. That's supposed to be my question. I know, but you look terrified. I am. Grace smiled through tears. Yes. They married at a small church with 37 guests. Grace's father had died when she was 19. Her mother had passed away 4 years later. She had no siblings. Daniel's parents did not attend. He had told them about the wedding. Margaret called it humiliating. Richard told him that if he wanted to play at being ordinary, he could do it without dragging the Reed name through a small-town ceremony. Daniel almost told Grace the truth that night. He stood in the tiny kitchen of their rented house while she slept and looked at his phone. One call, that was all it would take. He could tell her everything. He could explain why his parents had refused to come. He could show her who he really was. Instead, he turned off the phone. He told himself he wanted Grace to love him without money. What he did not admit was that the test had already ended. She had married him, she had already proven everything. From that moment forward, the secret was no longer a test. It was simply a lie. For several years, they were happy. Not perfectly. Their roof leaked, the truck died twice. Grace sometimes worked late. Daniel occasionally stared at his old life online when she was asleep. But they laughed. They danced badly in the kitchen. They ate takeout on the floor when the second-hand couch broke. When Grace caught pneumonia one winter, Daniel slept in a chair beside her hospital bed for 3 nights. When Daniel injured his hand at the shop, Grace changed the bandage every morning and told him ridiculous stories from the library until he stopped worrying. They talked about children. Grace wanted 2, Daniel wanted 3. They joked that neither of them could afford even one. Daniel felt a strange guilt every time she said it. Once, Grace stood in a baby store holding a tiny yellow blanket. She looked at the price tag and put it back. "Someday," she said, Daniel could have bought the entire store. He said nothing. That memory would return to him years later, with enough force to make him physically ill. Their first real crisis came in the 4th year of marriage. Daniel's father had a heart attack. Margaret called him from New York. For a moment, Daniel was no longer the mechanic in Belhaven. He was the only son of Richard Reed. He drove to Manhattan without telling Grace the entire truth. He said his father was sick. Grace packed him sandwiches for the drive. At the hospital, Richard looked smaller than Daniel remembered. The old businessman opened his eyes and said, "Are you done running?" Daniel sat beside him. "I wasn't running." Richard gave a weak laugh. "You moved to another state and changed your life because a woman hurt your feelings." It wasn't about Vanessa. It was about trust. Daniel looked down. Richard was right. Daniel stayed in New York for a week. During that week, he stepped back into the world he had abandoned. Assistants called him Mr. Reed, executives asked for decisions, drivers opened doors, people waited when he spoke. The power felt uncomfortable. It also felt familiar. When his father was discharged, Richard asked Daniel to return to the company temporarily. 6 months, he said, help stabilize things. Daniel refused. Then Richard said something that changed him. "One day this will all be yours whether you like it or not." Daniel returned to Belhaven, carrying that sentence with him. Grace met him at the door. She hugged him before asking anything. "How is your dad?" "Better." "And you?" Daniel almost told her. Instead he said, "Tired." Grace kissed his cheek. "Then eat, I made soup." He followed her into the kitchen and felt the first crack open between the life he had and the life he had hidden. 6 months later, Daniel started traveling to New York twice a month. He told Grace he was doing consulting work for a shipping company. Technically, he was. He simply did not mention that the company belonged to his family. Grace was proud of him. "You always wanted something more than the shop," she said. Daniel stared at her. Had he? Or had she simply seen the ambition he tried to hide? He became involved in Reed Logistics again. At first, only part-time, then more. His father trusted his instincts, the board respected him. Daniel discovered that he was good at the work, very good. He negotiated a regional acquisition that saved hundreds of jobs. He modernized a failing division. He spent more nights in Manhattan. And gradually, without meaning to, Daniel began dividing himself into 2 people. In Belhaven, he was Grace's husband. He drove the old truck, he fixed the leaking sink, he ate reheated pasta. In Manhattan, he was Daniel Reed. He wore tailored suits. He slept in a company apartment. He sat at tables where a bottle of wine cost more than Grace's monthly salary. At first, the contrast made him uncomfortable. Then it began to make Belhaven feel small. That was when Vanessa returned. Daniel saw her at a company reception. She was 35 now, divorced from a real estate developer, even more polished than before. She approached him with a glass of champagne. So the runaway prince came home. Daniel smiled despite himself, temporarily. Vanessa glanced at his wedding ring. "I heard you married." "And yes. Anyone I know." "No." Her eyes lingered on the ring. "Happy." Daniel answered too quickly, "Very." Vanessa smiled. That sounded convincing. He should have walked away. He did not. Over the following months, Vanessa became part of his business circle again. She understood the world Grace did not know existed. She knew the investors Daniel dealt with. She knew the restaurants. She knew which fund manager hated golf but loved sailing. She knew how to behave beside him at events. Daniel began comparing the two women without admitting it. Grace would call while he was at dinner and ask whether he remembered to take his allergy medicine. Vanessa would sit across the table discussing mergers. Grace wore the same winter coat for 5 years. Vanessa never repeated a dress at major events. Grace talked about a child who finally finished his first book. Vanessa talked about private equity. None of this made Vanessa better. Daniel knew that. But ego has a way of turning familiarity into superiority. And Daniel's ego had begun feeding again. One Friday evening, he returned to Belhaven after closing a $70 million deal. Grace had made meatloaf. The kitchen faucet was dripping. There was a pile of library books on the table. Daniel stood in the doorway wearing a suit worth $3,000 hidden beneath an old coat Grace recognized. For the first time, the house embarrassed him. Grace noticed. "What?" "Nothing." "You made a face." "I'm tired." She smiled, then sit down. Daniel sat. Grace served dinner. Halfway through the meal she said, "I was thinking we could finally repaint the living room next month." Daniel looked around. The walls suddenly seemed cheap. "Sure. Blue or greens?" "I don't care." Grace stopped. "You always care." "Grace, I said I don't care." The sharpness in his voice surprised both of them. She lowered her fork. "Okay." Daniel immediately felt guilty. But guilt did not stop the pattern. It only made him quieter. He started finding reasons to stay in New York. Meetings, whether late trains, client dinners. Grace believed him because she had built her marriage around trusting him. One evening, Vanessa kissed him. They were standing on the balcony of the company apartment after a dinner with investors. Daniel pulled away. For exactly 3 seconds. Then he kissed her back. When he returned to Belhaven the next morning, Grace was asleep on the couch. A lamp was still on. There was a bowl covered with foil on the table. A note beside it said, "Your favorite, heat for 2 minutes, love you." Daniel stood in the dark holding the note. He had never felt smaller. He should have confessed. Instead, he showered and crawled into bed beside her. The affair began with a kiss and grew through silence. Vanessa never asked Daniel to leave Grace at first. She did not need to. She knew Daniel was becoming addicted to the version of himself that existed in Manhattan. Around Vanessa, he was powerful. Around Grace, he remembered who he had been when he had no visible advantages. What Daniel once considered the greatest proof of love slowly became something he resented. Grace loved Daniel the mechanic. She did not know Daniel the heir. And because he had lied for years, he began blaming her for not knowing the man he had refused to reveal. It was easier than blaming himself. Meanwhile, Grace felt the marriage changing. She noticed Daniel's phone turning face down. She noticed new cologne. She noticed the way his eyes wandered when she talked. She noticed that he had stopped reaching for her hand in the car. One night she asked, "Are we okay?" Daniel was watching a financial report on his laptop. "We're fine." You barely look at me anymore. I'm working. You're always working. That's what happens when people try to build something. Grace flinched. The implication was clear. He was building, she was not. What does that mean? Daniel shut the laptop. It means I'm tired of struggling. I'm tired too. No, Grace, you're comfortable. She stared at him. Comfortable. You're happy with this. He gestured around the room. This house, that library job, counting every dollar, planning for a vacation we never take, you're happy surviving. Grace's face changed. I thought we were building a life. Maybe I want more. Then why didn't you tell me? Daniel stood. Because you wouldn't understand. Grace laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You're right, I don't understand the person you've become lately. Daniel left the room. That night, Grace cried quietly in the bathroom. Daniel heard her. He did not go to her. Years later, he would remember that sound more often than any argument they ever had. The following month, Daniel's father asked to meet Grace. Richard knew Daniel had still not told his wife the truth. You're 36 years old, he said. How long do you intend to continue this? Daniel looked out the office window. I'll tell her when things settle down. Things never settle down. She's happy. Richard stared at him. Is she? Daniel turned. Richard's voice softened. Your mother and I failed you in many ways, Daniel. We taught you to distrust affection because too much of the affection around us came with conditions. But you found someone who loved you before she knew anything. And instead of trusting that love, you kept testing it. I'm not testing her. No, now you're punishing her. Daniel's jaw tightened. You don't know anything about my marriage. I know Vanessa is back. Daniel went still. Richard sighed. I was a bad husband for a long time. I nearly lost your mother because I thought providing money excused absence. Don't inherit my worst habits along with my company. Daniel left angry. Not because his father was wrong. Because he was right. A week later, Margaret invited Daniel to a private dinner. Vanessa was there, so were several board members. Margaret spoke openly about Daniel taking over as chief operating officer within the year. It's time, she said. Daniel knew what that meant. Returning permanently, publicly. There would be interviews, profiles, photographs. Grace would find out. Vanessa touched Daniel's arm beneath the table. For the first time, he imagined a life where he did not have to explain anything. A life where he simply removed the complication. The complication was his wife. That was the ugliest thought Daniel Reed ever had. He did not recognize it as ugly in the moment. He called it practical. When he returned home, Grace was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea. I know there's someone else, she said. Daniel stopped. She looked exhausted. Not angry, exhausted. How? I don't need evidence to know my husband doesn't come home to me anymore, even when he's standing in the room. Daniel sat across from her. Grace looked at his wedding ring. Tell me the truth. He should have told her everything. The affair, the money, his family, the company, 7 years of deception. Instead, Daniel gave her only the part of the truth that allowed him to leave. Yes, he said, there's someone else. Grace's eyes filled. Do you love her? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation broke something. Grace looked away. I understand. No, you don't. Then explain. Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came. Grace wiped her cheek. Do you want this marriage? Daniel thought of the boardroom, the Manhattan apartment, the title, Vanessa, the life waiting for him. Then he looked at the tiny kitchen. No, he said. Grace nodded slowly. Okay. That was the beginning of the end. Daniel expected divorce to feel like freedom. Instead, it felt like moving through rooms where the air had been removed. Grace did not fight over possessions. There was almost nothing to fight over. She kept her books, he kept his clothes, she asked to keep a wooden box of photographs. Daniel agreed. He offered the old Honda, now repaired so many times that he knew every bolt. Grace said she wanted the truck instead because it reminded her of the first years of their marriage. Daniel gave it to her. The divorce paperwork listed his occupation as consultant. His disclosed income reflected only the modest consulting salary he had used while maintaining the secret. Daniel's lawyers could have structured everything differently. He deliberately kept Grace unaware. His attorney asked, "Are you certain your wife knows nothing about your beneficial interests?" Daniel said yes. "And you intend to disclose only what is legally required under the current filing structure." Daniel stared at the papers. And yes, the attorney did not approve. But he followed instructions. Grace received little. Daniel told himself she did not want money. The truth was, she did not know there was money to want. On the night she signed the final documents, Grace removed her ring. She placed it beside the papers. Daniel looked at it. "You can keep that." Grace shook her head. "No. It's yours. It belonged to us." He did not know what to say. Grace stood. At the doorway, she turned. "I hope the life you're choosing gives you whatever you think ours couldn't." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. "Grace." She waited. He almost told her, again. He almost said, "My name is not what you think. My family owns Reed Logistics. I have been lying since the day we met. Vanessa is not just some woman from my past. I am returning to a life I never let you see." Instead, he said, "I'm sorry." Grace looked at him with an expression he would spend years trying to forget. "So am I." Then she left. 2 weeks later, Daniel Reed was announced publicly as the incoming chief operating officer of Reed Logistics. His photograph appeared in business publications. Grace did not see it. She had stopped reading the news. She had also stopped sleeping properly. She moved into a small apartment above a bakery and returned to work 3 days after the divorce. Her friend Lee found her shelving books in the children's section. "You should be home." Grace kept arranging books. "Home is quiet. So is a library." "Exactly." Lee hugged her. Grace finally cried. Not the controlled tears she had allowed Daniel to see. Real ones. The kind that left her shaking. "I don't understand how someone can become a stranger while you're still married to them," she whispered. Lee held her tighter. Grace spent the next several weeks learning how to exist alone. She ate cereal for dinner. She avoided the road near the old house. She changed the emergency contact at work. She discovered how many ordinary forms required her to replace the word husband with friend. Then one morning, the library director called her into the office. "There's an invitation for you." Grace frowned. It was from the Hudson Literacy Foundation, a major nonprofit organization in New York. The foundation was hosting a gala to honor community educators. Grace had been nominated for an award because of the reading program she had created for adults with low literacy. She nearly refused. Lee forced her to go. "You spent 8 years helping people who were embarrassed to ask for help," Lee said. "You are not hiding because one selfish man forgot your value." Grace bought a navy dress from a consignment shop. Lee did her hair. They took a train to Manhattan. Grace had not been in the city for years. The gala was held at the Grand Armitage Hotel. Crystal chandeliers, white flowers, photographers. Grace immediately felt out of place. "You belong here," Lee whispered. I belong near the emergency exit. They left. For the first time in months, Grace felt almost normal. Then she saw the sign. Reed Global Foundation. The name meant nothing for 1 second. Then she saw Daniel. He stood across the ballroom wearing a tuxedo. Margaret Reed was beside him. Vanessa Hale stood on his other side. Cameras flashed. Behind them was a large display showing Reed Logistics, Reed Global Foundation, and photographs of Daniel beside business leaders. Grace stopped breathing. Lee followed her gaze. Oh my God. Daniel turned. Their eyes met. Everything in his face disappeared. Grace looked from him to the company logo. Then to a huge photograph of Daniel and Richard Reed at a corporate event. Her former husband. The mechanic. The struggling consultant. The man who had told her they could not afford a new water heater. The man for whom she had once skipped dental treatment because they were short on money. The man she had loved without condition. Daniel Reed. Heir to Reed Logistics. Grace looked at Lee. I think I'm going to be sick. Daniel crossed the room. Grace. She stepped backward. Don't. People nearby noticed. Vanessa watched from a distance. Daniel lowered his voice. I can explain. Grace laughed. The sound was sharp and broken. You're rich. Daniel looked around. Not here. You're rich. Yes. How rich? Grace. How rich? He swallowed. My family is worth several billion. Grace stared at him. Several billion. Her mind filled with memories. Coupons, overdraft fees. The time she sold her mother's necklace to cover Daniel's physical therapy after he injured his hand. The night they sat without heat because the furnace broke and Daniel insisted they could not afford an emergency repair. The birthday when Grace told him she did not need a gift because money was tight. The baby blanket she put back. 7 years. 7 years of believing every sacrifice was shared. Grace's voice dropped. You watched me worry about money. Daniel's face tightened. I was trying to live independently. You watched me sell my mother's necklace. I didn't ask you to do that. You let me. Daniel flinched. Grace's eyes filled with tears. You let me believe we were struggling together. I loved you. No. I did. No, Daniel, you studied me. The sentence landed harder than anything she could have shouted. You wanted to know if I would love you poor, Grace said, so every day of our marriage was some kind of experiment. It wasn't like that after we married. Then why didn't you tell me? Daniel had no answer. Grace nodded. That's what I thought. Vanessa approached. Daniel, people are watching. Grace looked at her. Vanessa stopped. There was something in Grace's face that even she did not know how to dismiss. Grace turned back to Daniel. Did she know? Daniel said nothing. Grace understood. Of course she did. She looked between them. You didn't leave me for a different woman. You left me for a different version of yourself. Daniel whispered Grace. She stepped away. Don't ever say you left because I was satisfied with too little. I thought we had little because you lied to me. Then she walked through a ballroom full of wealthy strangers with her head high until she reached the restroom. Once inside, she locked herself in a stall and broke down. Lee found her 20 minutes later. Grace was sitting on the floor. I sold my mother's necklace, she said. Lee knelt. What? He had hundreds of millions of dollars, and I sold the last thing my mother gave me because I thought we couldn't afford his medical bills. Lee's face hardened. Grace pressed both hands over her eyes. He watched me do it. That night, Daniel did not stay at the gala. He returned to his penthouse alone. Vanessa called 6 times. He ignored her. He sat in the dark and remembered the necklace. Grace had told him it was an antique locket. Her mother had worn it every day. Daniel injured his hand in the repair shop during their 3rd year of marriage. The insurance coverage was poor. Physical therapy cost more than they expected. One afternoon, Grace came home and said she had found a way to pay. Daniel asked how. She smiled and said, "I sold something." He had known. He had known what she sold. He had nearly transferred money into their account. Then he stopped because he was afraid Grace would ask where it came from. So he let her sacrifice the locket. Daniel stood suddenly and walked to the bathroom. He was sick. The next morning, he called a private jeweler. "Find it." The jeweler asked what he meant. Daniel described the locket. He called the pawn shop in Belhaven. Records were checked. The necklace had been sold again years ago. Daniel spent 6 months searching. Money could locate almost anything. Eventually, the locket was found in the private collection of an antiques dealer in Boston. Daniel paid $40,000 for a necklace Grace had sold for $900. He mailed it to her. The package returned unopened. He sent it again through Lay. Grace sent it back. Finally, Daniel drove to Belhaven. Grace was leaving the library when she saw him beside the truck. She stopped. Daniel held the small velvet box. "I found it." Grace looked at the box. Her eyes filled immediately. "My mother's necklace." And yes. For a moment, Daniel thought she might take it. Then Grace looked at him. "Why?" "Because you should have it. I should never have had to sell it." "I know. You knew then." Daniel could not lie. "And yes." Grace nodded slowly. "You knew." "I was afraid." "Of what?" "That if I told you everything, things would change." Grace looked almost amazed. "Things did change." "I know." "No, you don't." She moved closer. "You were afraid money would make me treat you differently, so you lied until the lying changed how you treated me." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." Grace looked at the velvet box. "Keep it." "Grace, please. I don't want my mother's necklace to become another thing you bought after hurting me." "It was yours." "It was." She walked past him. Daniel called after her. "Can we talk?" Grace stopped without turning. "We talked for 7 years, Daniel. The problem was that you were never telling me the truth." She left. For the first time, Daniel began to understand that regret was not the same as repair. He could regret lying, he could regret cheating, he could regret leaving. But regret did not return time. It did not restore trust. It did not erase the fact that Grace had loved an identity he had manufactured, while the real Daniel stood behind it, judging whether her love was pure enough. Vanessa did not understand his guilt. "You're romanticizing her because she rejected you," she said one evening. Daniel looked across the restaurant table. "She was my wife. And now she isn't. Because of me." Vanessa sighed. She would never have fit into this life. Daniel stared at her. It was something he had told himself many times. Now it sounded ugly. "How do you know?" Vanessa shrugged. "Daniel, she works in a public library. And so this world requires a certain kind of person." Daniel thought of Grace standing in the gala ballroom after discovering 7 years of lies. She had looked more dignified than anyone else in the room. "What kind?" Vanessa frowned. "You know what I mean." Daniel did. That was the problem. He ended the relationship 2 weeks later. Vanessa laughed when he told her. You think your librarian is taking you back? No. Then what exactly are you doing? Daniel answered honestly, stopping one mistake from becoming another. Vanessa threw her drink in his face. For once, Daniel thought he deserved it. Richard Reed died the following year. His final months changed Daniel. Cancer reduced the powerful businessman to a thin man in a hospital bed. Grace heard about his illness through the news. She considered sending a note, then she decided against it. Richard had known the truth about Daniel's identity. He had encouraged Daniel to tell her, but he had also remained silent. Grace did not hate him. She simply no longer wanted to participate in the Reed family's complicated relationship with truth. Before he died, Richard asked Daniel about Grace. Have you fixed it? Daniel sat beside the bed. No. Why not? Because some things aren't mine to fix. Richard looked at him for a long moment. You finally learned something. Daniel smiled sadly. Too late. Usually is. Richard died that night. After the funeral, Daniel became chief executive of Reed Logistics. He inherited shares worth hundreds of millions. Business magazines called him one of the youngest major logistics CEOs in the country. His photograph appeared on covers. None of it felt like victory. Daniel bought his childhood penthouse from his mother. He renovated the company headquarters. He expanded employee health care. He created education grants. People praised his leadership. He could not stop thinking about a $40 kitchen table. Grace rebuilt her life slowly. The Literacy Award brought attention to her program. A regional nonprofit offered funding. Grace used the money to open a larger community reading center in an abandoned bank building. She called it the Lantern. The name came from something her mother used to say. When you don't know the whole road, carry enough light for the next step. The Lantern offered adult literacy, after-school tutoring, job applications, computer classes, and free books. Grace became its director. She was not wealthy. She did not suddenly become famous. Her life remained modest. But it was hers. That mattered. 2 years after the divorce, Daniel saw her name in an article. He read it 3 times. The photograph showed Grace standing beneath a hand-painted lantern sign, surrounded by children. She looked happy. Not dramatically happy. Not the kind people perform for cameras. She looked peaceful. Daniel had forgotten what that looked like. He made an anonymous donation of $200,000. Grace returned it. The bank contacted his foundation. The Lantern director had declined the funds. Daniel called her. It was the first time she answered in almost a year. Why did you send it back? Grace was silent for a moment. Hello to you too. Daniel closed his eyes. Sorry, hello. Hello. Why did you send it back? Because I knew it was you. It was anonymous. Your foundation has never donated to a literacy center with fewer than 10 employees. Daniel almost smiled. You always were good at research. I work with books. It's money, Grace, no conditions. There are always conditions with you. That's not fair. Grace's voice remained calm. Maybe not, but it's how I feel. Daniel looked out his office window. What if the foundation makes the grant through another organization? I'd still know. You need the money. We need funding, we don't need yours. Daniel was quiet. Grace softened slightly. I know you're trying to help. I am. But you're still trying to solve discomfort with resources. Daniel flinched. My father used to do that. I know. How? Because you used to complain about it. Daniel remembered. Years earlier, lying beside Grace in their small bedroom, He had told her his father never apologized without buying something. Grace had laughed. Then don't become him. Daniel had promised. He became him anyway. What am I supposed to do? He asked. Grace was quiet. You live with it. With what? The fact that being sorry doesn't always mean the person you hurt needs something from you. The call ended gently. That was worse than anger. 3 years passed. Grace dated a man named Samuel Brooks, a high school history teacher. Daniel learned about him accidentally through Lee's public social media page. Samuel was not rich, he wore terrible sweaters, he volunteered at the Lantern. He had a daughter named Lily from a previous marriage. Daniel stared at a photograph of Grace, Samuel, and Lily decorating a Christmas tree. His chest hurt. He had once imagined children with Grace. He had delayed because he thought there would always be time. Now she was helping another man's daughter hang a paper star. Daniel closed the photograph. He did not contact her. That was one of the first unselfish things he had done in relation to Grace. He wanted to. He wanted to drive to Belhaven. He wanted to explain that he had changed. He wanted to tell her he still loved her. Instead, he asked himself a question Grace had once taught him without realizing it. Would telling her help her or only relieve him? The answer was obvious. So Daniel stayed away. Samuel proposed to Grace the following spring. She said no. Not because she wanted Daniel. She simply was not ready. Samuel understood. They continued dating for another year. Then they separated kindly. Daniel did not know any of this. He only knew Grace had disappeared from Samuel's photographs. For weeks, he fought the temptation to see that as an invitation. It was not. Grace's life was not a door waiting for Daniel to knock. During that same year, Margaret Reed suffered a stroke. She recovered physically, but the experience softened something in her. One afternoon, she asked Daniel to take her to Belhaven. Why? I want to see where you lived. Daniel hesitated. Then he drove her. The old rented house had new owners, the repair shop had expanded, they passed the library. Margaret stared through the window. This is where she worked. And yes. And you were happy here. Daniel gripped the steering wheel. For a while. Margaret looked at him. I was cruel about her. You never met her. That didn't stop me. Daniel said nothing. Margaret sighed. I thought wealth protected us from bad choices. Mostly it gave us more expensive ways to make them. Daniel laughed quietly. It sounded like something Richard might have said at the end. They stopped at the Lantern. Margaret asked to go inside. Daniel nearly refused. Then he saw Grace through the window. She was kneeling beside an elderly man at a computer, showing him how to enlarge the text. Daniel's heart reacted before his mind. Margaret noticed. You still love her. Daniel looked away. And yes. Does she know? She knows I'm sorry. That isn't the same thing. No. Margaret watched Grace. Are you going inside? Daniel shook his head. No. Why? Because she didn't ask me to. Margaret studied her son. Then she smiled sadly. You did learn something. Daniel drove away. That winter, the Lantern's heating system failed during a severe cold snap. Grace received 3 estimates. All were more than the center could afford. A local news station covered the story. The next morning, a heating company arrived and replaced the entire system at no charge. Grace assumed a local donor had intervened. Months later, she discovered Daniel had not paid for it. Margaret had. Grace called her. Margaret answered nervously. I hope I haven't offended you. Grace sat at her desk. Why did you do it? Because children were cold. That's all. Margaret was quiet. No. Grace waited. I owe you an apology. Grace closed her eyes. You don't owe me anything. I do. I helped create a son who believed love had to be tested. And when he found someone who loved him honestly, I treated that as beneath us. Grace did not know what to say. Margaret continued. I was wrong about you before I ever knew you. I am sorry. Grace stared at the repaired heater vent. Thank you. Margaret exhaled. I won't bother you again. You're not bothering me. They spoke for 20 minutes. Then again 2 weeks later. An unlikely friendship began. Daniel did not know. Margaret deliberately kept it from him. This is my relationship, she said when he finally discovered it, not a bridge for you to cross. Daniel respected that. Another year passed. Grace was now 40. Daniel was 41. 7 years had passed since the night he asked for divorce. Almost as long as their marriage had lasted. The symmetry haunted him. Reed Logistics had grown. Daniel's personal fortune had nearly doubled. He owned homes he rarely visited. His calendar was full. His life was empty in ways money could not describe. He dated occasionally. Nothing lasted. Whenever a woman showed interest, Daniel wondered what she knew about him before the first dinner. His name, his company, his wealth. The test he had once created to protect himself had become impossible to repeat. He finally understood that Grace had been the answer. He simply had not trusted the answer. One summer afternoon, Daniel received a letter. Not an email. A letter. The handwriting stopped him before he opened it. Grace. Inside was a simple note. Daniel, your mother told me your foundation is expanding its adult education grants. The Lantern is partnering with 6 rural libraries next year. I am not asking for money. I am asking whether your logistics team might help us solve a transportation problem involving mobile libraries. If you are willing to discuss it professionally, call the office number below. Grace. Daniel read the letter twice. Then he called. Professionally. He kept his promise. Reed Logistics helped build a route system for 6 mobile library vans. Daniel assigned a project manager. He did not use the project as an excuse to see Grace. 3 months later, she invited him to the launch. Daniel almost declined because he did not trust himself. Margaret said, "Go behave." He laughed. The launch took place in Belhaven. Children painted handprints on the side of one van. Local teachers spoke. Grace thanked community partners. Then she thanked Reed Logistics. Daniel stood in the back. Afterward, Grace approached him. Thank you. You're welcome. They stood awkwardly. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of separation, millions of unsaid words. Grace smiled slightly. You look older. Daniel laughed. So do you. Rude. Honest. She looked at him. Something you eventually learned. He nodded. Eventually. For a moment, they were almost the people who had once eaten blueberry muffins in a repair shop. Then the moment passed. Grace glanced toward a nearby table. A young volunteer waved. I should go. Daniel nodded. Grace. She turned. I'm glad you're happy. Grace studied him. I'm not happy every day. No one is. No. She smiled. But I'm at peace. Daniel swallowed. That's better. Yes. She walked away. Daniel stood alone beside the mobile library van and understood that this might be the closest thing to forgiveness he would ever receive. Not reconciliation. Not a second chance. Peace. He had spent years believing regret meant wanting the past back. Now he understood. Real regret was finally respecting the future you no longer belonged in. That evening, Daniel drove past the old rented house. The porch had been repainted, a bicycle lay on the lawn, a family lived there now. He parked across the street. For a few minutes, Daniel allowed himself to remember. Grace dancing barefoot in the kitchen. Grace laughing when the roof leaked into a cooking pot. Grace sleeping beside him while he stared at bank accounts she did not know existed. Grace holding the tiny yellow baby blanket. Grace selling her mother's necklace. Grace signing divorce papers. Grace discovering his name beneath the lights of a Manhattan ballroom. He had once believed wealth was dangerous because people might love him for it. He never considered the opposite danger. That hiding wealth could turn love into a test no person deserved to take. His phone rang. It was Margaret. "Where are you?" "Bellhaven." She was quiet. "At the house." "And yes." "Come home." Daniel looked at the porch. "Home." The word had changed meaning many times. "Yeah," he said, "I'm coming." Before leaving town, Daniel stopped at a small antique shop. The owner was closing. Daniel asked if he could buy a box. "A jewelry box." "And yes." "For a gift." Daniel thought of the locket locked in a safe in his Manhattan home. "No," he said, "for something I need to keep." He bought a simple wooden box. Back in New York, he placed Grace's mother's necklace inside. For years, he had kept it in velvet as though value came from its price. The wooden box felt more appropriate. He wrote a note and placed it underneath. It said only, "She gave this up because she believed we were carrying the same burden. I let her. Never forget what that says about the man you were." Daniel kept the box in the drawer of his desk. Not as punishment, as memory. Years later, Reed Logistics established a permanent national literacy transportation program. Daniel refused to put his name on it. The program helped mobile libraries reach communities where transportation was limited. Grace's organization became one of its partners. They saw each other occasionally. At conferences, at launches, at Margaret's 70th birthday. They became capable of speaking without pain controlling every sentence. Grace eventually remarried. The man's name was Thomas Avery. He was a widowed pediatric nurse with 2 sons and absolutely no interest in corporate finance. Daniel met him once. Thomas knew who Daniel was. There was no hostility. That almost hurt more. Thomas shook his hand. "I've heard a lot about the logistics program." Daniel looked at Grace. She smiled gently. "Only the good parts." Daniel nodded. "I'm glad." And he was. Grace married Thomas in a garden behind the lantern. Daniel was not invited. Margaret was. She asked whether Daniel wanted her to stay home. He shook his head. "No, she's your friend." The day of the wedding, Daniel worked. At sunset, Margaret sent him one photograph. Grace stood beneath strings of lights wearing a simple ivory dress. She was laughing. Thomas was looking at her, the way Daniel remembered looking at her before fear, ambition, and ego changed him. Daniel stared at the photograph. Then he typed, "She looks happy." Margaret replied, "She is." Daniel set the phone down. He walked to the window of his office. New York stretched beneath him. Buildings, lights, power. Everything he had once believed he needed to reclaim. He had all of it. The strange thing was that he no longer hated the wealth. Money had never been the enemy. The lie was. Fear was. Pride was the belief that love had to prove itself endlessly before he was required to trust it. Daniel finally understood that Grace had never failed his test. She had loved the mechanic. She had loved the man with the old truck. She had loved the husband who counted coins at the grocery store. She had loved him when she believed there was no inheritance, no company, no penthouse, no future except the future they built together. And when he finally showed her the billionaire, it was only after the billionaire had betrayed everything the mechanic promised. That was the tragedy. Grace would have loved Daniel Reed. He simply never gave her the chance. He had been so afraid that money might corrupt her love that he allowed secrecy to corrupt his own. Daniel looked down at the city. Somewhere far from the tower, Grace was beginning another chapter. Not because she had won, not because Daniel had lost, but because life had continued. That was perhaps the hardest truth of all. The person you hurt does not always remain frozen in the moment you hurt them. They heal. They rebuild. They laugh again. They fall in love again. And eventually, your regret becomes something they no longer have to carry. Daniel returned to his desk. He opened the drawer. The wooden box was there. He touched the lid but did not open it. Then he turned off the office light and went home. Not to the home he once shared with Grace. That life was gone. But to the life he had left. A life filled with responsibility, consequences, and the difficult work of becoming a better man, even when the person who deserved that better version would never receive it. Grace once told one of her literacy students that learning to read did not change the words already printed on a page. It changed what came next. Daniel's thought about that often. He could not rewrite the chapter where he lied. He could not erase the affair. He could not remove his signature from the divorce. He could not return the years Grace spent believing they were poor together. He could not give her mother's necklace back in a way that restored what it represented. He could not become the husband she deserved retroactively. All he could do was decide what kind of man would exist on the next page. And somewhere in Belhaven, Grace closed the lantern after another long day. Thomas waited outside with coffee. One of his sons had fallen asleep in the back seat. Grace locked the door. She looked through the glass at rows of books, computers, children's drawings, and photographs from the mobile library program. On one wall was a framed sentence in her mother's handwriting. When you don't know the whole road, carry enough light for the next step. Grace smiled. Thomas handed her the coffee. Ready? And yes. They drove home. Grace did not think about Daniel that night. That, more than anger or revenge, was how completely she had finally become free. And Daniel, miles away, understood something he should have understood the first day Grace brought him 2 blueberry muffins because she insisted on paying her debts. Love was never proven by how little someone would accept. Love was proven by what 2 people were willing to tell each other when telling the truth was frightening. Grace had offered him honesty from the beginning. Daniel had offered her a test. She passed. He failed. And the fortune he once hid to protect his heart became the very thing that helped him understand the price of losing the woman who had loved him when she believed he had nothing at all. There was one final lesson Daniel learned before Grace remarried, and it came from the smallest place imaginable. The diner. The same diner where he and Grace had shared their first real date. Daniel returned there one rainy afternoon because a meeting in Philadelphia had been canceled and the highway toward New York was blocked by an accident. He told himself he stopped only for coffee. The truth was that he had driven 20 minutes out of his way. The diner looked almost exactly the same. Red vinyl booths, chrome edges, a pie display near the register, a jukebox that had not worked properly even when Daniel and Grace were dating. He sat in their old booth. A waitress he did not recognize poured coffee. Daniel stared across the empty table. Years earlier, Grace had sat in that seat and told him that she did not care whether he ever became successful. Daniel had laughed. Everyone cares about success. Grace had shaken her head. I care whether you become someone you can respect when nobody is watching. At 29, Daniel had thought the sentence was charming. At 41, he understood it. He had spent much of his adult life worrying about whether other people loved the correct version of him. He had spent far less time asking whether he respected the version of himself they were given. The waitress returned. Anything else? Daniel looked at the menu. 2 blueberry muffins. She placed them in a paper bag. Daniel almost laughed. He drove to the parking lot of the old repair shop and ate one in his car. The muffin was ordinary. Too sweet. A little dry. Nothing like the memory. That was when Daniel understood something else about regret. Memory preserves what reality cannot reproduce. He could buy the same truck model. He could find the same wedding ring. He could purchase the old house if he wanted. He could even recover a necklace that had traveled through 3 owners. But he could not recreate a Tuesday afternoon when Grace walked into a repair shop, believing he was an ordinary mechanic, and smiled because he offered her kindness without asking for anything back. That moment existed only once. He had been loved before anyone knew what he could provide. There was no amount of money that could purchase a second first meeting. Daniel finished the muffin and left the other one untouched. Before driving away, he carried the paper bag into the repair shop. The owner, Frank, was older now. He recognized Daniel immediately. Haven't seen you in years. I know. Frank looked at the suit, the car outside, then back at him. World finally caught up with you. Daniel smiled faintly. Something like that. Frank had been one of the few people who knew Daniel's identity from the beginning. He had kept the secret because Richard Reed had once helped him after an accident. Daniel placed the muffin on the counter. Frank looked at it. What's this? Interest. Frank laughed. Then his expression became serious. I heard about Grace. Daniel looked down. Everybody did eventually. She was good to you. I know. Frank leaned against the counter. No, you know now. Daniel looked at him. Frank did not soften the words. She used to come in here after you started traveling. Asked me if I thought you were unhappy. She thought maybe she had done something wrong. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. What did you tell her? That you were complicated. That was generous. It was cowardly. Frank sighed. I kept your secret too. You promised my father. Still doesn't mean I feel good about it. Daniel looked around the garage. The smell of oil, rubber, and metal carried him backward in time. Did she ever ask if I was cheating? Frank hesitated. Once. Daniel closed his eyes. What did you say? I said I didn't know. You did know. I suspected. Daniel nodded. Frank crossed his arms. You know what she said after that? Daniel did not want to know. What? She said, if he's unhappy, I wish he would just tell me. I can survive the truth. I don't know if I can survive feeling crazy. Daniel turned away. That sentence followed him all the way back to New York. For years, he had thought Grace's deepest wound came from discovering his wealth. Now he understood that the money was only evidence. The deeper betrayal was that he had made her doubt her own perception. She had sensed distance. He told her everything was fine. She had sensed another woman. He hid his phone. She had sensed that Daniel wanted a different life. He made her feel small for being content with the life he had deliberately created. He had not merely lied about money. He had forced Grace to live inside his lie, and then blamed her for not seeing beyond it. That realization changed how Daniel apologized from then on. He stopped saying, "I never meant to hurt you." Intent no longer seemed important enough. He stopped saying, "I was afraid." Fear explained choices, it did not erase them. He stopped saying, "I loved you." Love without honesty had become a claim Grace was no longer required to validate. The next time Daniel and Grace spoke, months later at a literacy conference, he said something different. "I made you doubt yourself." Grace looked at him in surprise. Daniel continued, "When you knew something was wrong, I told you nothing was wrong. When you asked whether I was unhappy, I made you feel as if wanting a simple life was the problem. You weren't imagining anything. You were right. I'm sorry I made you question that." Grace was silent for several seconds. Then she nodded. "Thank you." Daniel had apologized hundreds of times in his mind. Those two words from Grace meant more than all of them because for once, he had apologized for what she experienced instead of explaining what he intended. They did not hug. They did not cry. Grace did not suddenly forgive everything. But when she walked away, Daniel felt something inside him settle. Not hope. Responsibility. It was a quieter feeling. A more useful one. And years later, when young executives at Reed Logistics asked Daniel for advice about leadership, he sometimes told them a story without names. He told them about a man who hid something important because he was afraid of being judged for it. The man believed secrecy protected him. Instead, the secret slowly taught him that everyone else was responsible for proving they could be trusted, while he never had to prove the same. Daniel would end the story with one sentence. "If you make people take a test they don't know they're taking, don't be surprised when you become the one who fails it." Most executives assumed he was talking about business. Daniel never corrected them. Grace, meanwhile, never told Thomas every detail about Daniel immediately. She had learned that honesty did not require spilling every wound before trust had time to grow. But when their relationship became serious, she told him everything. Not because Thomas demanded it. Because Grace refused to build another important relationship around silence. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked only one question. "Do you still love him?" Grace thought carefully. "I love who I thought we were," she said. "Sometimes I think I'll always love that memory, but I don't want that marriage back." Thomas nodded. "I can live with that." Grace smiled. That answer mattered. He did not ask her to erase Daniel. He did not compete with a ghost. He simply made room for the truth. And in that ordinary act, Grace discovered the difference between being questioned and being known. By the time she married Thomas, she no longer measured her healing by whether Daniel's name hurt. She measured it by how rarely she needed to measure anything at all. The past had become part of her story, instead of the place where her story stopped. If this story stayed with you, there are more emotional dramas waiting for you here. On this channel, we share stories about marriage, betrayal, hidden identities, family secrets, regret, second chances, and the decisions that can change an entire life. If you enjoyed Daniel and Grace's story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating long emotional stories for you to listen to and enjoy. And before you go, tell us in the comments. If you were Grace, would you ever have taken Daniel back after discovering the truth? Was hiding his wealth understandable in the beginning? Or did the secret become unforgivable the moment he allowed her to sacrifice for a struggle that was never real? There is no simple answer, and that is why stories like this stay with us. Thank you for listening. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. And remember, sometimes the greatest regret is not discovering that someone loved your money. It is discovering that someone truly loved you without it and realizing you were the one who destroyed that love.